Currently moving your way. Make sure the plane is ready to deliver supplies. Over.
It's extremely urgent that we get these medical supplies out.
There are nights when cinema feels like a mirror of collective fear, when explosions on screen echo the kind of chaos our modern world constantly anticipates. One such night for me was the first time I saw Olympus Has Fallen. Sitting there, I remember the faint glow of the White House on screen before it descended into smoke and fire, and something about that moment reminded me how deeply America's anxieties have always fed its thrillers. The premise alone is built on a pulse of national panic. The symbolic fall of power, the shattering of security, and the lone man rising from rubble to reclaim control. Yet beyond the gunfire and debris, the movie tapped into something strangely timeless: our fascination with collapse, and with those who dare to stand amid it. It begins with the warmth of familiarity, an American presence surrounded by trusted men, laughter over dinner, a snowfall that softens even the heart of the Secret Service. Gerard Butler's character, Mike Banning, exudes that quiet blend of loyalty and competence that defines the archetypal protector. We sense in him not just duty but affection. His bond with the president's family feels genuine, almost tender. But within minutes, tragedy strikes in a flash of ice and metal, rewriting the balance of loyalty and guilt. What follows is a fall not only of a nation's bastion, but of one man's self-belief. That emotional fracture, more than the later siege, forms the emotional core of the story. When I revisit the film today, what strikes me most is its pacing, relentless yet strangely human. The attack sequence unfolds with a cold precision that reflects the early 2010s obsession with realism in action cinema. Not stylized fantasy, but chaos that feels tactile, almost documentary in tone. The sound of collapsing walls, the flashes of shoulder-fired missiles, the helplessness of civilians, they all build a sense of vulnerability rarely admitted by Hollywood's depictions of American might. For a few minutes, the invincible empire looks fragile, and that fragility is where the film finds its heartbeat. Banning's journey to the wreckage is, on paper, an old tale, the disgraced hero called back by circumstance. Yet Butler's performance lends it a weary nobility. There's no gleaming armor here. His heroism feels bruised, personal, and laced with the guilt of someone who has already failed once. The cinematography supports that tone. Shadows dominate the corridors, gunfire flickers like flashes of doubt, and the camera keeps close to him, letting us breathe his tension. Even the color palette, steely blues and muted grays, speaks of a world drained of certainty. I've always thought that stories like this work not because of spectacle, but because of recognition. Beneath the explosions lies a structure as old as myth, the fall of Olympus itself, the assault on the divine seat of power, and the mortal who must climb back up to defend it. The title, intentionally echoing the home of gods, invites that parallel. The White House becomes Mount Olympus, the terrorists modern titans, and Banning, an unexpected demigod forced to restore order. What makes the experience gripping is not just the political tension, but the primal echo of that archetype. The lone guardian battling chaos to save a father figure and a fragile civilization. Watch it again years later. I realize how unapologetically the movie embraces its genre DNA. There's no ironic detachment, no winking self-awareness. It's earnest, loud, and proud of it. In an era increasingly dominated by quips and CGI saturation, its old-school brutality feels refreshing. The physicality, the bruised fists, the close-quarters combat, the claustrophobic hallways, remind us of a time when action heroes bled on screen and bore the scars visibly. Its die-hard's lineage revived in a post-9/11 world, shaped by new fears but fueled by the same defiance. What elevates the first act beyond formula, however, is the emotional residue left after the initial disaster. We see not only a nation under siege, but a man confronting redemption. That duality makes every gunfight carry weight. Every small victory inside those bullet-riddled walls feels like a personal absolution. Even the quiet moments, his radio exchanges, his pauses before advancing, feel soaked in remorse. The script doesn't linger on sentimentality, but Butler's body language says enough. His pauses, his brief exhales, his clenched jaw. The heroism here is not loud. It's burdened. There's also something to be said about the cultural texture of the film's release. 2013 was a decade into America's war on terror fatigue. Yet cinema kept revisiting the image of the homeland under threat. Olympus Has Fallen distilled that unease into pure adrenaline. Not a meditation, but a catharsis. Watching cities burn on screen became a way for audiences to control their dread. Destruction choreographed, danger containable, order restored before credits roll. In that sense, the movie serves as both mirror and anesthetic, reflecting fear while easing it through fantasy. What fascinates me as a viewer of both literature and film is how such stories reinterpret the concept of the citadel. From ancient myths to Shakespearean tragedies, the fortress always falls, so that virtue may prove itself anew. The siege becomes a test of the moral architecture inside, not merely the stone walls. Here, the fall of the White House forces every character, from the president to the aides in the bunker, to reveal their essence. Cowardice, courage, treachery, faith, all surface under pressure. That stripping away process feels almost ritualistic, as if the film were less about politics and more about purification through fire. By the time the smoke settles in those early sequences, we've witnessed something paradoxical, a national nightmare rendered thrilling. The pleasure is uneasy but undeniable. That's the alchemy of action cinema, to turn horror into rhythm, fear into spectacle, and grief into momentum. And in doing so, it reveals a truth about audiences too, that we crave danger when it is safely framed, chaos when it can end within 2 hours. Perhaps that's why Olympus Has Fallen still resonates, because behind explosions lies an emotional architecture built from guilt, duty, and the timeless desire for redemption. So, literature-loving friends, as we embark on this exploration, remember that what we're really studying here isn't merely the choreography of violence, but the psychology beneath it, the fall and the climb, the sin and its atonement, the ruins that demand rebuilding. The White House may burn, but the myth of the lone protector endures, and it's that myth that keeps audiences returning to stories like this. Stories that let us watch Olympus fall, just so we can believe again in its rising. It opens with a false calm, a wintry stillness that hides the storm to come. The first moments draw us into intimacy, not action. The presidential motorcade gliding through icy roads, the friendly exchanges between President Asher, his wife, and Mike Banning. There's laughter, small talk, the easy rhythm of people who trust each other. Even the snow feels gentle, as if nature itself were blessing their bond. But then, as in so many tragedies, serenity turns traitor. The accident on the bridge, that sudden, brutal rupture, not only takes the First Lady's life, but fractures Banning's spirit. His attempt to save her, failing by inches, becomes the invisible wound that haunts every later decision. When I first watched it, I remember feeling how quickly loyalty can mutate into guilt. One slip, one impossible choice, and a protector becomes a mourner. From that moment, Banning's exile feels inevitable. Transferred to desk duty at the Treasury, he becomes a ghost within the system, the man who used to stand beside power but now watches from afar. The film lingers just long enough on his isolation to make us feel it. The flicker of news coverage showing the president without him, the impersonal corridors, the mechanical nature of routine. It's a quiet but necessary fall from grace, echoing those old narratives where heroes must first ascend before earning the right to rise again. And then, one ordinary morning, routine shatters. The setup to the assault unfolds with chilling calculation. A South Korean delegation arrives at the White House, the kind of diplomatic meeting that screams normalcy. But the mood shifts almost imperceptibly. A helicopter's approach, a suspicious pattern of coordination, a brief exchange that seems off. Suddenly, the air thickens. Chaos erupts not with one explosion, but with many, synchronized like a deadly symphony. Streets flood with gunfire. The skies rain debris, and the symbol of invincibility, that pristine white facade, becomes a battleground. The cinematography makes it all brutally close. Smoke, screams, bullets striking marble. You don't watch this sequence so much as feel it, like tremors under your seat. I remember thinking, in that first wave of attack, how deliberate everything felt. Not cinematic exaggeration, but an attempt to replicate the shock of modern terror. The film's editing rhythm mimics panic. Shortcuts, rapid shifts, overlapping screams. It's not polished heroism yet. It's confusion. People fall before they can react. Agents shout orders drowned by noise. The flag flutters in flames. And then the attackers breach the gates. Olympus Has Fallen becomes not just a code phrase, but a prophecy fulfilled, the ultimate symbol of vulnerability. The United States heart, its mythic Olympus, lies open and bleeding. What's striking in this first half is how alone Banning becomes almost instantly disconnected from command. Trapped between duty and protocol, he doesn't wait for authorization. He moves. His instincts override bureaucracy, a recurring theme in these archetypal stories. He slips back into the White House like a ghost of the man he once was, moving through smoke-filled corridors and corridors littered with the dead. Every step feels improvised, desperate. The claustrophobia builds. This isn't the sleek espionage of James Bond. It's close-quarter survival, raw and personal. Inside the bunker, the situation mirrors external collapse. The president and security staff and senior officials descend underground, thinking safety lies in depth. But it's an illusion. The attackers, led by calm, articulate, frighteningly composed, reveal their infiltration was never partial but total. The so-called guests were the invaders. Kang's control of the bunker transforms power itself into captivity. It's one of those moments where I felt the story's mythic undertone flare again. The gods trapped in their own temple, betrayed by false worshippers. Outside, Banning listens, calculates, adapts. His earpiece becomes his only link to the world above, a reminder that he's simultaneously part of the system and utterly cut off from it. The way Butler plays these moments, restrained but determined, carries the first half. His expression rarely breaks. He's a man running on discipline, guilt, and instinct. When he dispatches the intruders one by one, the violence feels earned, not flashy. It's fast, functional, and quietly furious. You sense that every bullet he fires is aimed not just at enemies but at his own regret. Meanwhile, the Pentagon command, represented by Morgan Freeman's calm but burdened Trumbull, becomes the chorus to this modern myth. They watch helplessly through surveillance feeds, their dialogue filled with protocol and disbelief. Olympus Has Fallen repeats like a ritual refrain, an acknowledgement that the unthinkable has occurred. The president is hostage. The Capitol is compromised. The lone protector is their only thread of hope. It's a setup so familiar it could feel cliché, yet somehow the film's urgency rescues it. Each line, each command, carries weight because the stakes have never felt so tactile. One of my favorite early exchanges is when Banning first reestablishes contact with command. His tone, clipped professional, almost cold, masks the personal drive beneath. "I'm inside." That single phrase shifts the film's momentum. It's the moment the hunted becomes the hunter. The action tightens, the lighting darkens, and the corridors turn into a chessboard of death. You can almost feel his training reawakening, methodical, efficient, merciless. And yet, through all this, the film never forgets his humanity. Between kills, there's silence, not the heroic calm of an invincible man, but the weary pause of someone counting ghosts. As the siege continues, the attackers demand access to the Cerberus codes, the mythic-sounding key to America's nuclear deterrence. The parallel is hard to miss. Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld, becomes a metaphor for deterrence itself, a beast whose chains, once broken, could unleash hell. The film screenwriters knew exactly what they were doing. They dressed geopolitics and myth, turning the security apparatus into an allegory for power barely leashed. The first half, therefore, isn't just action. It's ritual. A fall, a test, a reawakening. And somewhere within that ritual lies a heartbeat of redemption. Every decision Banning makes in these early scenes carries echoes of the night on the bridge, a man still trying to save what he once lost. When he speaks with the president's son, trapped somewhere inside, we see a flicker of tenderness beneath all the gunfire. He becomes both warrior and guardian, the human thread connecting father, son, and fallen nation. That motif of protection, intimate yet grand, anchors the chaos. By the time the first half closes, the stage is fully set. Olympus lies in ruins, the president is captive, the world watches in disbelief, and one man, scarred and uninvited, walks its shadowed halls alone. It's the archetype of the wandering knight, reborn in tactical gear instead of armor. But the spirit remains ancient, one man, one oath, against impossible odds. The first half ends not with victory, but with a pause, the kind of breath that precedes a storm. We know what's coming, but it's the quiet right before that keeps us hooked. The knowledge that redemption, like revenge, always demands descent before ascent. The second half begins in the thick of darkness, both literal and moral. The White House stands desecrated, a monument turned mausoleum. Inside, Kang's calm cruelty fills the air. He's the kind of antagonist who doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His voice is precise, deliberate, chilling. He has already won the external war. What remains is psychological warfare, control through fear. The president's defiance becomes his last weapon, but even that wavers as his staff begin to die one by one. The tension isn't only about power now. It's about endurance. How much pain can conviction survive before it fractures? Banning, meanwhile, stalks the corridors like a revenant. The film tightens its focus entirely around him. Every echo of gunfire, every flicker of light becomes part of his silent ritual. His movements are intimate, practical, unsentimental. You can tell he's no longer fighting for medals or country. He's fighting because guilt demands it. Each room he clears is less about strategy and more about confession. The camera stays close, giving us the rhythm of his breath, the metallic whisper of his weapons, the small glances that betray exhaustion. And yet, there's resolve in that exhaustion, the kind that makes you trust a man who has already lost everything once. As Khan begins executing hostages, the narrative finally exposes the scale of his plan. His goal isn't merely ransom or negotiation. It's erasure. Using the Cerberus codes, he aims to detonate America's own nuclear arsenal against itself. It's not chaos for profit. It's apocalypse for ideology. That's what gives this half of the film its mythic heft. Kong doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as retribution incarnate. The myth of Olympus burns again. Gods punish their hubris by one who feels wronged by their dominance. The Pentagon, powerless but watching, becomes a reflection of impotence dressed as order. The military language, copy that, visual confirmed, authorization pending, rings hollow in contrast to Banning's raw immediacy. You sense the film drawing a line between systems and souls. Bureaucracy paralyzed above ground, one man's while burning below. It's an old Hollywood dichotomy, but one that still hits home, especially when the world feels full of institutions too slow to act while individuals pay the price. The sequence where Banning rescues the president's son is one of the film's emotional peaks. The boy's fear is quiet, not exaggerated, not dramatized, and Butler plays the scene like a father figure rediscovering his purpose. When he promises the child safety, the line carries weight because we've seen him fail before. This isn't just about saving the boy. It's about undoing that night on the bridge. And when he leads the child through those hidden passageways, the moment feels almost spiritual, a guide leading innocence through the underworld. It's no coincidence that the corridors are dimly lit, narrow, like veins within the body of the fallen Olympus. After securing the boy's escape, the film shifts gears from rescue to reckoning. The dialogue grows sharper, the score heavier. The president, still captive, refuses to surrender his final code. Kang's composure begins to crack, subtly, but enough for us to see the human behind the ideology. He underestimates the one man moving unseen through his empire. It's a mistake every self-proclaimed god eventually makes, believing that control eliminates risk. The second half becomes a series of converging movements. Kong tightening his grip, the Pentagon preparing a risky assault, and Banning crawling ever closer to the throne room of ruin. The fights escalate, but never lose grit. One moment that always stands out is Banning's encounter in the communications room, a close, suffocating struggle lit by flickering monitors. It's brutal, not elegant. Every punch feels desperate, every stab final. The choreography reflects fatigue as much as strength. Unlike the invincible heroes of later franchises, Banning bleeds, stumbles, and curses. His heroism lies not in perfection, but in persistence. That realism is what keeps the film grounded. When he finally breaches a control center, the tension narrows to a razor's edge. Kang's men fall one by one, and the confrontation between the two is inevitable. The collision of order and chaos. Their exchange before the final fight is brief but layered. Kong calls him a relic of a dying empire. Banning responds not with patriotism but defiance. The subtext isn't America versus its enemies. It's duty versus nihilism. In that small, grim room, the myth of Olympus plays out like a modern tragedy. The protector against a usurper, redemption measured in violence. The fight itself is merciless, no slow-motion glamour, no witty lines. It's fists, knives, sweat, and exhaustion. You can almost feel the concrete beneath their feet, the dull thud of impact echoing through the bunker. And when Banning finally kills Kong, it's not a victory cheer that follows, but silence. The heavy silence of survival. Even his breathing sounds like disbelief, as if he knows that winning here doesn't erase what's already been lost. That's the film's quiet honesty. The hero saves the world, but not himself. The climax with the Cerberus detonation sequence drives that point home. The countdown becomes an auditory pulse, faster and faster, as he struggles to disable the system. The numbers blink red like the heartbeat of a dying god. And when he finally stops it, with seconds to spare, there's no sweeping music, no glorious salute. Just exhaustion, relief, and the soft collapse of a man who's given every last ounce of will. The Pentagon erupts in cheers, but inside the White House, the victory feels private, almost mournful. Olympus stands again, but scarred. The film closes its plot arcs with restraint. The president is freed, order restored, flags raised. Yet beneath the protocol and ceremony, there's a weight in Banning's eyes. His reinstatement feels symbolic, but hollow. Redemption, yes, but redemption in a world still capable of falling again. The White House gleams under sunlight once more, but we, the audience, have seen its walls bleed. That's the image that lingers. Beauty rebuilt over trauma, civilization pretending to forget its fractures. As the camera pulls back on the repaired facade, there's a quiet irony. The system rewards a savior at one sideline, but we sense that the cycle will repeat. That piece, like architecture, is only ever temporary. That's perhaps why the story endures beyond its action show. It's a myth retold from modern fears. Olympus may rise again, but only because men like Banning exist, scarred, sleepless, and waiting for the next fall. Watching that ending, I always think of the duality that defines his genre. Victory painted in shades of grief. It's the paradox that keeps such stories compelling. The idea that strength doesn't come from certainty but from endurance. And when the credits roll, That's the emotion that stays, not triumph, but quiet respect for the man who held the line when gods fell silent. When I think about this film, I don't first recall the explosions or the spectacle. I remember faces, tense, tired, determined faces. It's a story driven not by armies, but by individuals whose convictions clash under pressure. The film's strength lies in how it builds those characters not as archetypes alone, but as emotional vessels of duty, grief, and ideology. Watching again, I realize that beneath its gunfire is a quiet psychological drama about identity and the burdens of responsibility. At its core stands Mike Banning, the everyman hero carved from stone and scar tissue. Gerard Butler plays him not as a superhero, but as a soldier defined by restraint. His masculinity feels earned, not advertised. The way of the First Lady's death at the beginning lingers in his eyes throughout, visible in his pauses, and the way he clenches his jaw before each decision. He embodies the American myth of the fallen knight, loyal to a kingdom that has momentarily exiled him, waiting for a chance to serve again. His guilt is both wound and compass. Every choice he makes after the attack stems from that inner need for redemption. When he risks his life inside the burning White House, it's not patriotism that drives him first. It's atonement. Butler's performance is fascinating because it's almost anti-charismatic. There are no speeches, no romantic subplots, no melodrama. Instead, he communicates through minimalism, short breaths, sharp eyes, and an economy of movement. In a genre often obsessed with flair, his quietness feels almost spiritual. He reminds me of Hemingway's heroes, men who say little but bear entire moral worlds inside them. That's why, even when he's breaking necks or firing guns, you sense compassion beneath the violence. He kills not out of rage but necessity, and that makes him oddly tragic. A man fated to keep saving the same world that never truly saves him back. Opposite him stands Kong Yansak, portrayed with chilling poise by Yune. Kong is one of those villains who disturb precisely because they are calm. He's educated, articulate, even polite, yet beneath that surface lies absolute conviction. His dialogue lacks the grandiose flourishes of typical antagonists. Instead, it's measured, logical, precise, like a surgeon dissecting hypocrisy. He believes the West's dominance deserves humiliation, and he carries out his vengeance with almost sacred devotion. What makes Kong interesting is that he's not chaotic. He's orderly. In a film drenched in chaos, that order becomes his most terrifying quality. Kang's composure contrasts beautifully with Banning's restrained anger. They mirror each other in discipline, but differ in motive. Both men are soldiers, both bound by loyalty, one to ideology, the other to conscience. Their final confrontation, then, isn't merely physical. It's philosophical. Banning represents redemption through protection, Kong through destruction. In another world, they could have been the same man, forged by different nations, loyal to different myths. That mirroring makes the film's final act feel more than just action. It feels like the closing argument of two moral systems colliding. Then there's President Benjamin Asher, played by Eckhart, who manages the impossible, making authority seem human. In most action thrillers, presidents are symbols, flags with dialogue. But Eckhart gives Asher vulnerability, even fear. When he's dragged through corridors, beaten and bound, he doesn't lose his dignity, but you can see the terror flicker beneath the surface. His relationship with Banning, strained after the First Lady's death, adds emotional depth to both. Their unspoken bond, mentor and protege, father figure and son, fuels the story's emotional engine. By the film's end, when they face each other again, there's a reconciliation that transcends politics. It's not just leader and guard. It's two men who survived a shared trauma and found grace and loyalty. Morgan Freeman's Alan Trumbull, acting president during crisis, represents calm amid hysteria. He's the voice of reason when everyone else is drowning in procedure. Freeman's gravitas turns exposition into poetry. Every line feels like a moral checkpoint. His composure isn't authority for its own sake. It's wisdom drawn from understanding human fragility. When he speaks, it's as though the film pauses to breathe. He personifies endurance, the belief that leadership means serenity under fire. Without him, the chaos in the Pentagon scenes might have collapsed into noise. Among the supporting cast, Secret Service Director Lynn Jacobs, Angela Bassett, brings a motherly intensity to her authority. Her character radiates empathy wrapped in command. The way she looks at Banning, part pride and part worry, grounds the film emotionally. She's a moral witness, the one who sees a human cost beneath the mission reports. In a movie driven by men of action, her presence adds conscience. Even in limited screen time, she anchors the institutional world with grace and quiet authority. Another overlooked but essential presence is the president's son, Connor. He's the film's moral mirror. Innocence caught in the machinery of conflict. Through his eyes, we glimpse what's truly at stake, not politics, but legacy. His fear is understated, his trust in Banning absolute. When Banning saves him, it's not just a plot point, it's spiritual closure. The boy's rescue becomes a symbolic redemption of the child Banning once failed, the child that haunts every soldier who's ever lost someone. Kang's followers, by contrast, are faceless, not because they lack identity, but because the story intends them to embody ideology without humanity. They are function over flesh, the opposite of Banning's weary individuality. The film uses this contrast to remind us that conviction without empathy becomes machinery. Their uniform efficiency mirrors the robotic nature of extremism, discipline without compassion, strategy without soul. Every major character, even those briefly seen, seems sculpted around one central tension: loyalty versus conscience. Each must choose between obedience to command and the moral intuition of what's right. For Banning, it's the courage to disobey orders to save lives. For the president, it's the choice to sacrifice himself rather than endanger his country. For Kong, it's loyalty twisted until it becomes vengeance. And for Trumbull, it's leadership tested by the temptation to act rashly. In that sense, the film isn't just about saving a nation. It's about preserving humanity within institutions that often strip it away. When the credits roll, these characters stay with you not because they're extraordinary, but because they feel like echoes of familiar human struggles: guilt, purpose, faith, survival. Even the villains remind us that evil rarely begins as evil. It begins as conviction, untethered from compassion. And the heroes remind us that true strength is rarely loud. It's the quiet endurance of those who act when others freeze. Watching it now, I see Olympus Has Fallen as a story about the invisible cost of protection, the toll it takes on souls who stand between order and chaos. Each character bears scars from carrying that weight. They're not symbols of perfection. They're portraits of fatigue, perseverance, and grace under pressure. And perhaps that's why they endure beyond the screen, because in them we recognize fragments of ourselves in a world that often feels just as fragile, just as ready to fall. Every movie, no matter how mainstream, hides a set of strange, revealing details beneath its surface. Choices in production, context, or reception that shift how we perceive what unfolds on screen. Olympus Has Fallen may look like a straightforward action thriller, but it's packed with small peculiarities that make it a fascinating artifact of its era, a mixture of coincidence, cultural tension, and creative conviction. The first strange fact is that Olympus Has Fallen wasn't the only film to imagine an attack on the White House that year. In an almost eerie coincidence, Roland Emmerich's White House Down was released just months later. Two films, two directors, two studios, and almost identical premises, a lone agent defending the president during a siege. It's as though Hollywood's collective subconscious was tapping into a national anxiety, a craving for catharsis through destruction. The difference was tone. Olympus Has Fallen played it grim, grounded, and brutal. White House Down went glossy and humorous. History, of course, favored the former. The darker one always seems to outlive its flashier twin. Another unusual detail lies in the film's authorship. It was directed by Antoine Fuqua, who had previously helmed Training Day. That alone is striking. Fuqua, known for blending moral ambiguity with muscular realism, brought a kind of ethical gravity to a genre that often drowns in spectacle. He wasn't just interested in explosions. He wanted tension that felt earned, violence that revealed character. His decision to shoot much of the film with handheld cameras and low lighting gave it a gritty intimacy uncommon in studio action movies of time. You feel close to the characters, as though you're there in the smoke and blood, rather than watching from the safety of spectacle. Then there's the curious reality that much of the White House in the film was built, not digitally but physically. The production constructed a full-scale replica of key areas, including the Oval Office and West Wing corridors. It was done on sound stages in Shreveport, Louisiana, far from Washington, D.C., and yet the attention to detail was obsessive. Even the artwork and furniture placements were meticulously recreated from reference photographs. That authenticity is part why the siege sequence feels tactile. The bullets chip real walls, not pixels. You can almost smell the dust. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes oddities is how the film's title nearly wasn't Olympus Has Fallen. Early drafts floated names like White House Siege and code name Olympus. The eventual title was a compromise between tone and metaphor. Olympus, lending mythic gravitas, and Has Fallen, supplying immediacy. The final phrase reportedly came from the Secret Service's real code name for the White House. Olympus, that tiny factual anchor, tucked into chaos of fiction, lends a whole story a sense of eerie plausibility. When the code phrase is spoken on screen, it lands with both realism and mythology. Another strange layer is geopolitical. The villains were North Korean commandos, a choice that sparked quiet discomfort among some Asian American groups at the time. It wasn't just a portrayal, it was the timing. The film premiered when U.S. North Korea tensions were flaring again over missile tests, and some critics argued that the movie exploited current fears for box office gain. Yet what's fascinating is that the script's original villains weren't Korean at all. Early drafts centered around a domestic paramilitary group. The change was reportedly made late in development to internationalize the threat, perhaps to align with studio marketing instincts that foreign villains travel better in global markets. In hindsight, that shift altered the film's entire psychological tone, from civil fracture to external invasion, from introspection to projection. A subtler curiosity involves its sound design. Fuqua and his team built an acoustic map of the White House's interior to ensure that every gunshot, every explosion, echoed believably within marble halls. Rather than layering pre-made sound effects, they recorded gunfire in enclosed replicas to capture the dense, ear-ringing reverberation unique to narrow corridors. That's why the film's action sequences don't sound like conventional Hollywood mayhem. They have a claustrophobic realism, a kind of sonic authenticity that unsettles more than it thrills. Then there's Gerard Butler himself, not just star but also producer. Few realize how instrumental he was in getting the project made. When studios hesitated at financing yet another presidential siege movie, Butler personally pushed it through by attaching his name and financial backing. In interviews, he described the film as a return to human-scale heroism, his attempt to revive the grit of 80s and 90s action cinema before digital excess took over. That personal stake explains the performance's sincerity. He wasn't just acting in Olympus Has Fallen. He was betting his post 300 career on it. The visual tone, too, hides a secret homage. The cinematographer, Conrad W. Hall, son of the legendary Conrad L. Hall, who shot American Beauty, reportedly studied black and white war photography from Vietnam and Kosovo to influence the lighting palette. The goal was to make every frame feel like a documentary snapshot, harsh, unpolished, and immediate. Even the choice of color grading, bluish-gray highlights, and desaturated warmth was meant to echo the cold bureaucracy of power meeting the heat of chaos. It's not a coincidence that the most visually beautiful shots often involve destruction. Fuqua once said, "Tragedy is cinematic because it's honest." Another peculiar connection is how this film quietly influenced a micro-trend of one-man army White House fantasies that followed, from London Has Fallen to Angel Has Fallen. Yet while those sequels lean into bombast, the original remains the most grounded, because it treats its hero not as invincible but as haunted. The franchise's evolution becomes almost a study in cultural tone. The first film about fear and redemption, the later ones about endurance and excess. It's as if the purity of the original's desperation couldn't survive its own success. A smaller but symbolic detail many miss. In the Oval Office scenes, the American flag stands behind the president's desk at a slightly off-center angle, not perfectly vertical. It's subtle, but the production designer said it was intentional. That crooked flag symbolizes imbalance, the moral and political disarray of the state under attack. Most viewers never notice, yet subconsciously, it unsettles the symmetry we expect from that iconic room. And then there's a strange, almost poetic afterlife of the phrase, "Olympus has fallen." Within days of the film's release, it entered online political commentary, used metaphorically to describe moments of national failure or scandal. The film had invented a phrase that transcended itself, turning cinematic fiction into linguistic shorthand. Even years later, headlines still occasionally echo it when institutions stumble. Few action movies achieve that kind of cultural ghosting. Finally, the strangest fact of all might be emotional rather than factual. Despite its explosions and machismo, Olympus Has Fallen resonates because it plays like a lament, not a celebration. It mourns what's lost before it glorifies what's saved. And perhaps that's why, amid all its peculiarities, real White House replicas, accidental twin films, late villain swaps, and mythic titles, the film endures. It's not just an action fantasy, but a mirror of modern uncertainty. That uneasy knowledge that even the mightiest citadels can fall, and that we watch them crumble again and again to remind ourselves we can rebuild. When Olympus Has Fallen first hit theaters, it arrived not as an art film but as an adrenaline jolt, an unapologetic action thriller that critics were ready to dismiss. Yet beneath the noise of bullets and national flags, it ignited a peculiar debate about patriotism, realism, and America's relationship with fear. I remember reading those early reviews. They were divided not along lines of quality, but ideology. Some praised it as a lean, hard-edged revival of old-school heroism. Others derided it as flag-waving propaganda disguised as cinema. But over time, something interesting happened. The film refused to vanish. It kept returning to discussions about how Hollywood processes trauma, particularly post-9/11 anxiety. At its release in 2013, the shadow of 9/11 still loomed large over American storytelling. Even a decade later, popular culture hadn't stopped revisiting the image of falling towers, breached perimeters, and lone saviors rising from ruins. Critics from The Atlantic and The Guardian pointed out how Olympus Has Fallen translated those fears into spectacle, turning national vulnerability into something both terrifying and thrilling. The destruction of the White House was cinematic therapy, a way for audiences to confront dread in controlled doses. It's telling that while the attacks in the film are horrifying, the camera never flinches. Fuqua makes us look, as if saying, "You can't heal what you refuse to face." Some reviewers compare it to Die Hard, the most flattering comparison any action movie could receive. Indeed, Olympus Has Fallen is structurally Die Hard in the White House, a single man trapped inside with terrorists, forced to outthink and outfight them. But what elevates it, in hindsight, is tone. Die Hard was laced with irony and humor. Olympus replaced that with sincerity and moral weight. There's almost no levity here, no comic relief. That choice divided audiences. To some, it was refreshing, to others, oppressive. But it made the film feel more honest to its cultural moment. America wasn't laughing at its pain yet. It was still trying to contain it. Film scholars later noted that Fuqua's direction gave the story unexpected psychological depth. He'd come from Training Day, a film about corruption, morality, and redemption through violence. Applying that sensibility to a White House siege turned a conventional thriller into something that resembled an emotional crucible. Every explosion became a confession, every death a moral reckoning. Critics of the Los Angeles Times even wrote that Fuqua films grief as if it were action, and that might be the truest summary of his style. Beneath all the patriotism, there's mourning for lost innocence, for institutional failure, for the myth of invulnerability. Culturally, Olympus Has Fallen landed at an inflection point. The war on terror narrative was fading. Audiences were growing cynical about endless military heroics. Yet they still crave stories of resilience, not global conquest, but survival at home. That's a paradox the film captured perfectly. Its violence wasn't about expansion. It was about defense. In that sense, it reflected America's emotional state in 2013, weary, self-doubting, and longing for a simple story where good still triumphed, even if barely. Another interesting perspective came from international critics. In South Korea and Japan, reviews fixated less on the action and more on the portrayal of North Korean antagonists. Some accused the film of inflaming Cold War-era stereotypes, while others shrugged it off as fantasy. Yet a few Asian critics found unexpected nuance in Kang's character. noting how his cold discipline reflected not cartoonish villainy, but real geopolitical frustration with Western dominance. It's an uncomfortable interpretation, but reveals how perspective reshapes meaning. What feels patriotic in one country can feel imperialistic in another. That tension is what makes the film worth discussing beyond its explosions. At festivals and retrospectives years later, film academics began treating Olympus Has Fallen as part of lineage. Siege films that dramatize the collapse of moral and physical structures. It joined a lineage that stretches from Zulu to Black Hawk Down to Die Hard. Each explores the idea of a fortress under attack as a metaphor for identity under crisis. But unlike its predecessors, Olympus placed that fortress at the symbolic center of the Western world. By letting the White House burn, it committed cinematic blasphemy, desecrating the altar to renew the faith. It's a narrative impulse as old as myth. Only by destroying the temple can the gods remember humility. The public response mirrored that duality. Audiences embraced it enthusiastically, even as critics wavered. It opened at number 2 at the box office, outpacing expectations and setting the stage for a franchise. Viewers called it the first real action movie in years, a phrase that, while hyperbolic, captured something genuine. People were nostalgic for sincerity in spectacle. The shaky cam realism of modern blockbusters had made them numb. Olympus brought back old-school clarity, practical explosions, and physical stakes. That visceral authenticity rekindled a forgotten pleasure, watching human courage rather than CGI endurance. Another curious cultural event followed. The film became an unexpected favorite among military audiences. On bases and among veterans, it was praised for depicting not just strength, but perseverance after failure. Soldiers spoke about identifying with Banning's guilt, the trauma of losing someone under your watch, the sleepless redemption of trying again. That emotional recognition elevated the film from mere entertainment to quiet empathy. It's rare for a mainstream thriller to evoke such sincerity among the very people it portrays. Still, the critics who dismissed it weren't wrong about its flaws. The dialogue can veer toward cliché, the villains are occasionally two-dimensional, and the nationalism is sometimes heavy-handed. But those elements, paradoxically, have aged better than expected. In a cinematic landscape now dominated by irony and detachment, Olympus Has Fallen feels refreshingly earnest. It doesn't wink at its audience. It believes in what it's showing. And belief, whether in gods, nations, or human decency, is rare currency in modern film. What fascinates me most is how the film's reputation improved over time. By the late 2010s, when action cinema had become almost completely digitized, viewers began reappraising Olympus as a last stand for tactile filmmaking. Its roughness, once criticized, became its virtue. The film now looks like a snapshot from a transitional era, the final gasp of analog heroism before the green screens took over. In that sense, it's both product and elegy of its time. And perhaps the most telling critical perspective is this. Olympus Has Fallen isn't about America's strength. It's about its fragility. The explosions are just punctuation marks for a deeper sentence, one that says, even the mightiest symbols can bleed. Critics who missed that were too focused on flags to notice the shadows behind them. Fuqua, in his quiet way, directed not a celebration but a confession, a story of guilt, fallibility, and grace reborn through chaos. Years later, when I think about where it sits in film history, I see it not as propaganda or paranoia, but as a snapshot of emotion, a culture trying to reassure itself that courage still means something. And in that struggle, it becomes something rare, a blockbuster that remembers pain and dares to find faith through it. Behind every moment of chaos in Olympus Has Fallen lies a world of meticulous planning, a crew of artists, engineers, and risk-takers who turn one of Hollywood's most secure symbols into a believable war zone. The finished product feels spontaneous, as if the White House truly fell overnight. But the reality behind it is an intricate dance of logistics, secrecy, and creative precision that reveals how calculated chaos must be to look real. The film's production began with a question that most directors wouldn't dare to ask. How do you destroy the White House without actually touching it? Antoine Fuqua's answer was both technical and philosophical. You don't destroy it, he once said. You recreate it, then make it earn its destruction. The team constructed a near life-size replica of the building's exterior and major interior corridors in Shreveport, Louisiana. Not a model, not CGI scaffolding, but a fully tactile environment with working doors, furniture, portraits, and bulletproof looking glass. The crew nicknamed it Little Olympus. Every wall had to be destructible, every fixture safe for explosions, and every corridor wide enough for stunt choreography yet narrow enough to feel claustrophobic on camera. That authenticity came at a cost. Reportedly over $7 million went into building and destroying the replica, yet it was worth it. Instead of the floaty unreality that plagues CGI-heavy blockbusters, Olympus Has Fallen radiates physicality. When walls shatter, you see dust, not pixels. When bullets rip through desks with splinters, not texture maps. It's tactile cinema, the kind of filmmaking that feels rare now. A return to the era when filmmakers believed audiences could feel authenticity through debris. Fuqua's directing approach on set reflected his background in music videos and gritty dramas. He treated every action scene as a form of choreography, less about spectacle, more about rhythm. He famously played music between takes, sometimes heavy percussion, to keep the actors in sync with the emotional tempo of the sequence. Gerard Butler, who also produced, reportedly said that shooting under Fuqua was like being in a pressure cooker. Everything's real, every hit counts. The bruises were real too. Butler performed many of his own stunts, earning cracked ribs and minor burns during one hallway explosion. The actor later joked that Olympus Has Fallen was the most painful love letter he'd ever written to America. One particularly demanding day involved the infamous C-130 gunship attack sequence. The team used a combination of scale models, computer-generated imagery, and practical pyrotechnics to achieve it. They built a section of the Washington Monument and blew it apart piece by piece using controlled charges, then composited those explosions with miniatures filmed under high-speed cameras. The effect fooled many into thinking the destruction was entirely digital, but roughly 60% of it was physical. That blending of old and new technology, analog smoke mixed with digital fire, became the film's unspoken signature. Fuqua's crew also included several real military consultants, including former Secret Service agents, who reviewed scripts and coached the actors. They adjusted tactical formations, corrected how agents would communicate under siege, and insisted on realistic reload times. Even small gestures, the way Banning clears a room, how he keeps his weapon close to his chest, were drawn from real training routines. That level of precision separates the film from most of its genre peers. It's not just fantasy, it's disciplined fantasy. One delightful production quirk is how much of the film was shot in oppressive heat despite its wintry look. Louisiana in summer can melt steel, yet the set had to appear snow-covered for the first act. Crews sprayed biodegradable movie snow made from paper pulp and soap foam across streets and roofs, while the actors sweated under wool coats. Between takes, assistants used towels and fans to keep Butler from overheating. Watching those snow scenes now, one would never imagine the air around them smelled faintly of detergent and humidity. The film's explosions were choreographed like orchestral pieces. The pyrotechnics team, led by explosives expert Keith Adams, had to time detonations within fractions of a second to avoid endangering actors. Many shots show real fireballs erupting just feet away from performers. Fuqua's direction to his crew was simple. If it looks too safe, it looks fake. That commitment sometimes caused arguments with studio safety coordinators, who reportedly called the set controlled madness. But it worked. The intensity on screen owes much to the nervous energy behind it. The casting process also has its own fun story. Morgan Freeman wasn't originally slated to play Trumbull. The role was first offered to another veteran actor, who withdrew at the last minute. Fuqua personally called Freeman, who agreed after a 10-minute conversation. The irony, of course, is that Freeman had already played God in other films. Here, he became the calm hand guiding Olympus through chaos. His presence, Fuqua later admitted, gave the movie credibility before the first frame rolled. Aaron Eckhart's training for the role of President Asher was equally interesting. To portray a believable commander-in-chief under duress, he met with former White House staffers and studied security footage of presidential drills. He said he wanted to understand what fear looks like when it has to stay composed. That small detail, fear hidden behind authority, shaped his performance and, indirectly, the tone of the entire film. Another production fact that often surprises people. The North Korean language spoken by Kang's team was carefully vetted for authenticity. A Korean linguist coached the actors daily to ensure the dialogue wasn't just gibberish. Yune, who played Kang, already spoke Korean fluently and even helped rewrite some lines to make them sound natural for a man of military intellect rather than generic villain dialogue. It's an underappreciated layer of realism that adds texture to what could have easily been cartoonish antagonists. The soundtrack, composed by Trevor Morris, deserves special mention. He approached it like an elegy rather than a march, combining low strings, solemn horns, and choral undertones that make the violence feel tragic rather than triumphant. One theme, Land of the Free, plays softly under a scene of the flag being lowered after the attack, a moment so quietly devastating that many viewers missed how subversive it was. The music mourns while the visuals explode, and that contradiction gives the film emotional gravity. Even in post-production, the creative choices remain daring. The editing team cut nearly 20 minutes of footage, most of it dialogue-heavy political scenes. Fuqua wanted the film to move like a heartbeat, constant, rhythmic, occasionally spiking but never pausing long enough for comfort. The editor reportedly said, "We didn't cut scenes, we cut hesitation." Finally, one of the strangest production anecdotes involves the film's premiere. During its first private screening for government officials and Secret Service consultants, some attendees reportedly found the realism unsettling. One advisor told Fuqua afterward, "You shouldn't have shown this to us before work." The director took it as the highest compliment. He'd succeeded in making fiction feel plausible enough to unsettle reality. Looking back, Olympus Has Fallen feels like the last of a breed. The kind of action film made with sweat, steel, and practical flame before Hollywood's transition into digital perfection. Every frame tells a story of people willing to risk discomfort for authenticity. And that's what makes a production itself as compelling as the film it birthed. An Olympus built to fall, only so that audiences could believe in its rise. The setting of Olympus Has Fallen is more than a backdrop. It's the heartbeat of the story, a stage where national mythology meets physical ruin. The White House, for most of cinematic history, has been a sacred image, a symbol of order, reason, and Western stability. Antoine Fuqua shattered that sanctity. He turned the structure from icon into battlefield, transforming a place of marble dignity into a claustrophobic labyrinth of fear. Every corridor, window, and wall becomes a character, each one bearing scars of invasion. Watching it, I always feel as though the building itself is breathing, exhaling smoke, trembling under fire, struggling to survive its own symbolism. From the very first frame, the aesthetic choices tell you that this is not a glossy action fantasy. The lighting is subdued, the tones heavy with gray and steel. It's a visual world of restraint rather than extravagance. The early snow scenes outside Camp David feel muted, almost painterly, an illusion of calm rendered in soft whites and pale blues. That serenity sets the emotional trap. When chaos erupts later, the shift from brightness to darkness feels like moral weather changing, as though light itself flees from the screen. Fuqua plays with that contrast meticulously. The purity of the opening snow gives way to the blackened smoke of the siege, mirroring innocence turned to guilt. The White House itself, recreated with obsessive precision, becomes a film's psychological map. The exterior represents idealism, clean lines, open space, symmetry. The interior, once invaded, devolves into a maze of shadows and whispers. Fuqua uses geography as metaphor. The deeper Banning descends, the more primal the conflict becomes. The basements and tunnels feel almost infernal, like the underworld of American myth. Each room holds echoes of fallen history. Portraits cracked, flags torn, chandeliers hanging like relative arrogance. By the time Banning reaches the bunker, we've traveled symbolically from Olympus to Hades. Cinematographer Conrad W. Hall crafts this descent with an eye for realism touched by melancholy. His camera rarely soars. It crouches. The lens stays close to faces, to sweat, to trembling hands. During the assault, the perspective feels almost documentary, handheld, slightly chaotic, mimicking the instability of crisis. But when the smoke settles, he composes shots with near religious stillness, as if to mourn the destruction he just recorded. The interplay between movement and stillness is what gives the film its pulse. moments of kinetic panic interrupted by frames of haunting calm. Color design plays a subtler but equally vital role. Fuqua and Hall drain the palette of glamour. Instead of the saturated reds and blues typical of patriotic films, they lean toward desaturated hues, slate gray, concrete brown, and muted navy. The American flag, usually vivid, appears dulled by ash. That choice strips nationalism of its poster brightness and gives it texture, as though patriotism itself were weathered. In the post-siege scenes, warm tones creep back in, not triumphant golds, but soft ambers suggesting endurance rather than victory. The progression from white to gray to amber is emotional alchemy. Innocence lost, chaos endured, humanity reclaimed. Sound design complements that visual arc perfectly. The White House doesn't just look violated, it sounds violated. Early scenes are filled with open sonic space. Distant birds, polite chatter, the hum of formality. Once the siege begins, the entire soundscape implodes. Bullets ricochet in confined hallways, creating metallic reverb that almost becomes percussive music. The explosions don't thunder like in typical action fare. They roar and then suffocate, leaving behind ringing silence. That ringing becomes an auditory motif, representing trauma, the aftermath of shock. In quieter moments, faint creaks of the building linger, like the groans of a wounded giant. Even the weather plays a role. The snow at the beginning isn't decorative, it's foreshadowing. Snow is purity, but also silence, the quiet that precedes tragedy. When the film returns to exterior shots of the city later, the snow has melted, replaced by rain and smoke. The transformation of climate mirrors the internal climate of the story, innocence thawing into confrontation. Few action films pay such poetic attention to weather, but Fuqua uses it as punctuation, the world outside reflecting the inner ruin of the nation's heart. What's fascinating is how Fuqua treats light as moral geography. Characters aligned with integrity are usually filmed in natural light or soft fill. Butler in cold blues, Freeman in balanced neutrals. Kong and his men, by contrast, are often lit from below or behind, their faces half immersed in shadow. But Fuqua resists cartoonish lighting. Even villains are given dimension. Kang's bunker is illuminated by computer screens, sterile light, cold intellect, while Banning's path is lit by emergency bulbs, flickering reds and yellows, human and imperfect. One represents the order of ideology, the other the chaos of conscience. The film's visual composition also borrows from military realism. Camera movements mimic surveillance footage, static shots from corners, low angles resembling security feeds. It's as though the audience becomes another unseen agent, forced to witness through the mechanical eye of the state. This perspective amplifies paranoia. We're always watching, yet powerless. When the camera finally breaks free into fluid motion near the climax, it feels like liberation, not just for Banning, but for us. Fuqua's staging of violence deserves particular attention. It's brutal, yes, but never fetishized. There's no slow-motion ballet of bullets, no aestheticized blood splatter. Violence in Olympus Has Fallen is quick, ugly, efficient. The camera rarely lingers on impact. Instead, it captures aftermath, bodies, silence, smoke. That restraint gives the film moral weight. We're not invited to cheer the kills, but to feel their cost. It's closer to tragedy than triumph. You can see that philosophy in how the score behaves, too. Instead of rising with each fight, it often falls away, letting the raw noise of combat dominate. Symbolism saturates the setting more deeply than most viewers realize. The White House, called Olympus by the Secret Service, isn't just a code name. It's the metaphor at the film's core. Olympus in mythology was a home of gods. Here, it's the fragile seat of human authority, pretending to be divine. When Olympus falls, it's a warning. Even gods bleed when they forget humility. The physical destruction of the building mirrors the moral erosion of power, a world that relied too much on invincibility, learning the language of vulnerability. Even in composition, Fuqua reinforces hierarchy and fall. Early in the film, he frames characters from low angles, powerful, elevated, confident. After the attack, those same characters are shot from above, dwarfed by ceilings, their authority visually diminished. It's a subtle psychological trick that makes the audience subconsciously feel the shift in control. When Banning regains agency, the camera stabilizes, returning to balanced framing, the cinematic language of regained equilibrium. The ending, with sunlight streaming through the repaired facade, is deliberately artificial. The sky looks too clean, the colors too bright. And that's the point. The restored Olympus isn't purity regained. It's a mask rebuilt. Fuqua wanted to look like propaganda because that's what recovery often is, an illusion of normalcy painted over trauma. When I first realized that, I understood the quiet irony of the closing shot. The flag waves again, but behind it lies rubble unseen. In the end, what makes a film setting unforgettable isn't its realism alone. It's a symbolic precision. Every architectural choice, lighting cue, and sonic detail speaks to a larger idea. The fragility of systems that mistake permanence for strength. The White House burns, not just as a building, but as a myth, and the smoke that rises from it feels like confession. Through its setting, Olympus Has Fallen turned geography into philosophy, the place where nations like men must fall to rediscover their humanity. There's always another story running parallel to the one we see on screen, the quieter, messier chronicle of how hundreds of people conjure catastrophe from scratch. The making of Olympus Has Fallen was itself a kind of siege, an independent-scale production pretending to be a blockbuster, fighting limitations of budget, time, and expectation. Watching the finished film, you'd never guess how improvised so much of it was, or how much of its conviction came from exhaustion. The project began modestly. Gerard Butler, fresh from 300 and navigating a career crossroads, wanted to produce something that reestablished him as a serious action lead. Studios at the time were skeptical. Mid-budget adult thrillers were vanishing, replaced by superhero franchises. Butler, with his own company G-Base, decided to bankroll early development himself. He reached out to Antoine Fuqua, whose training days still carried the smell of moral gunpowder. Fuqua initially declined. He'd sworn off large-scale action after wrestling with studio politics on Shooter. But Butler's pitch wasn't about spectacle. It was about redemption. A man who fails and saves. Butler said, "That's me right now." Fuqua later admitted that line hooked him more than any script could. Once Fuqua signed on, the production turned guerrilla. Millennium Films agreed to finance it at around $70 million, modest by Hollywood standards, on the condition that the team film almost entirely in Louisiana to exploit tax incentives. That decision reshaped everything: sets, logistics, even weather. Washington, D.C. had to be recreated inside a warehouse. Production designer Derek R. Hill began with government blueprints and photographs, but Fuqua pushed for atmosphere over accuracy. He told Hill, "I want the White House to feel like a church that's lost its faith." The art department spent 6 months building both the exterior lawn and interior corridors, only to demolish much of it across 40 days of shooting. Crew members joked they were building history just to blow it up. Fuqua's directing philosophy was immersion. He wanted actors to feel siege conditions physically. For the attack sequence, he insisted on real smoke machines and full-power wind turbines blasting debris at performers. Extras portraying civilians were deliberately kept uninformed about the timing of explosions to elicit genuine panic. In behind-the-scenes footage, you can see Butler sprinting through clouds of dust, coughing between takes but refusing oxygen masks until the crew wrapped the shot. "If I can breathe," he reportedly told Fuqua, "then so can the audience." The crew's dedication bordered on masochism. Stunt coordinator Alan Poplaton described the experience as controlled misery. Each hallway fight was rehearsed like a stage play, but filmed with handheld chaos. The decision to use minimal lighting, mostly practical lamps and flickering emergency bulbs, meant cinematographer Conrad W. Hall had to shoot at high ISO levels, pushing the limits of digital sensors. He wanted darkness to feel tangible, like a substance leaking into the frame. It worked. The film's gritty texture came directly from technical imperfection. Even the simplest moments required ingenuity. The snow-covered prologue was filmed during a sweltering August heat wave. To create snowfall, effects teams used paper fiber mixed with chilled foam sprayed through industrial fans. Crew members nicknamed the concoction Louisiana Snow. Butler, in a heavy wool coat, nearly fainted during the 12th take. Fuqua refused to shorten the scene, believing that real discomfort translated into authenticity. "If you're sweating under snow," he told the crew, "the lie feels truer." Post-production held its own drama. The initial cut ran over 2.5 hours, far more character-driven than what the studio expected. Early test audiences admired the intensity, but flagged pacing issues. Reluctantly, Fuqua trimmed nearly 30 minutes, including quieter sequences showing Banning's life after suspension. Some of those deleted moments reportedly deepened his loneliness, showing him visiting the First Lady's memorial and ignoring calls from colleagues. Their removal made the final film leaner, but also harder, stripping away introspection in favor of momentum. Fuqua later said he didn't regret the cuts, but missed the melancholy they carried. In another version, he mused, Olympus was almost a tragedy. Sound mixing took place in London, where Trevor Morris composed the score simultaneously. He wrote themes to picture rather than ahead of edit, a method that let him match rhythm to emotion. In one recording booth anecdote, Fuqua asked for a note that sounds like a flag falling. Morris experimented with descending French horns layered with low cello drones. That motif became the film's signature. You can hear it when the White House crumbles and again during the final salute. It's not triumphant. It's mournful, an elegy disguised as anthem. The cast camaraderie was genuine but built under duress. Morgan Freeman became an unofficial on-set philosopher, offering calm between chaotic days. Angela Bassett led warm-up stretches for security office sequences, telling younger extras, "Move like you believe this matters." Aaron Eckhart maintained presidential posture even off-camera, rarely sitting between takes to preserve his physical tension. Rick Yune, meticulous about authenticity, improvised subtle gestures, folding his hands before executions, as though performing a ritual. Fuqua loved that detail and expanded Kang's calm menace around it. Budget constraints forced constant compromise. Visual effects houses were instructed to use compositing sparingly. The aerial shots of Washington were real footage enhanced with miniature smoke plumes. Even the D.C. skyline at night came from time-lapse plates filmed by a 2-person crew camping near the Potomac. Because of those limitations, Olympus Has Fallen ended up looking more grounded than bigger contemporaries. Ironically, constraint became the film's greatest aesthetic strength. Marketing presented its own battle. Competing with White House Down meant differentiation through tone. While Emmerich's version emphasized charm and spectacle, Fuqua's campaign leaned on grit. Trailers used dark-color grading and heavy bass drones, with taglines like, "When our flag falls, our heroes rise." Butler personally recorded promotional voiceovers. The gamble worked. Audiences believed his film was a serious one, giving an edge at the box office despite smaller scale. Perhaps the most touching behind-the-scenes insight is what happened after filming wrapped. The crew gathered for one final scene, the flag being raised again over the restored White House. Fuqua asked everyone, including technicians and PAs, to stand behind the camera. As the fabric fluttered, he reminded them that every explosion they'd staged, every late night they'd endured, symbolized rebuilding. Someone filmed the moment on a phone. Butler can be seen wiping dust from his face, not acting anymore, just watching. It's an unscripted image of exhaustion that somehow mirrors the film's theme. Resilience that looks less like glory and more like endurance. Later, during interviews, Fuqua said that Olympus Has Fallen taught him something unexpected. That sincerity still sells when you strip away irony. "We didn't make a joke out of danger," he said. "We made danger the joke's absence." That attitude guided his later work, influencing everything from The Equalizer to Southpaw. In a sense, Olympus became a template, a reminder that emotional realism could coexist with blockbuster action if filmmakers treated fear and courage as human, not cinematic, qualities. Even years afterward, the bond between cast and crew endured. Many of them returned for sequels out of loyalty rather than contract. They called themselves the Olympus family. Butler once described them as a group that built a myth with bare hands and plywood. When you look at a film through that lens, not as a product, but as a record of shared fatigue and belief, its imperfections start to feel like fingerprints. You sense the sweat, the improvisation, the stubborn insistence on authenticity. That's the soul of Olympus Has Fallen, a story about walls collapsing, made by people who refuse to. Every enduring story hides a heartbeat beneath its action, a set of themes pulsing quietly under the noise. Olympus Has Fallen may masquerade as a conventional thriller, but its bones are built from myth, morality, and fear. Strip away the explosions, and what remains is a parable about redemption, power, and the illusion of security. Antoine Fuqua wasn't just staging an assault on a building. He was dramatizing a collapse of certainty, the fall of an idea masquerading as a fortress. The most immediate theme, of course, is redemption through failure. Mike Benedikt begins the film not as a hero, but as a man haunted by his own competence. He did everything right and still lost. That paradox defines him. His journey mirrors the ancient mythic arc. The fallen warrior called back from exile to cleanse the temple he once failed to protect. The title itself, Olympus Has Fallen, echoes that pattern. When gods stumble, redemption must come from a flawed mortal. Banning's redemption isn't about glory but about reclamation, the slow restoration of self-respect in the crucible of chaos. Every punch he throws feels like a confession, every victory a prayer. Fuqua turns the action genre inward, transforming violence into spiritual atonement. Another central theme is the fragility of power. The White House, nicknamed Olympus, stands as the embodiment of Western authority, symmetrical, guarded, confident. Its downfall in the film isn't just physical, it's symbolic. The invincible fortress proves porous, the organized hierarchy collapses into confusion, and the ultimate symbol of protection becomes a prison. In a single day, the seat of global strength transforms into a tomb of hostages. That reversal forces the audience to confront an uncomfortable truth. Institutions built on control are most vulnerable to the chaos they deny. The fall of Olympus is therefore not only a terrorist triumph, but an allegory for hubris, the arrogance of believing that power is the same as safety. Beneath that, there runs a subtler theme of duty versus emotion. The film's opening tragedy, Banning's failure to save the First Lady, establishes this tension. Should he have prioritized the president or the woman in peril? His choice defines his exile. Later, when the White House burns, he faces the same moral equation in larger form, the life of one versus the salvation of many. The story becomes a meditation on professional loyalty colliding with human feeling. Fuqua, who often explores moral gray zones, crafts Banning as a man torn between protocol and conscience. His redemption comes not by obeying orders but by defying them, proving that true duty sometimes requires rebellion. The film also meditates on the illusion of control. Kang's takeover of the White House exposes how systems designed to protect can also entrap. Secure rooms become cages. Codes meant for deterrence turn into weapons, and hierarchy transforms into paralysis. The bunker, meant to symbolize safety, becomes a stage for the president's humiliation. It's a neat reversal, protection as vulnerability. That irony stretches beyond the film's narrative into a broader philosophical statement about modern civilization. Our strongest structures often conceal our greatest fragilities. There's also a fascinating layer of mythological symbolism embedded in the narrative. Naming the White House Olympus was no marketing whim. It reframes the story as a modern myth. Khan becomes a titan figure, the rebel striking at the gods. Banning, the mortal hero, must ascend through metaphorical hell to restore cosmic balance. Even the Cerberus device, the nuclear safeguard, borrows directly from Greek mythology, a guardian of the underworld whose power, once unleashed, could destroy the world. By invoking those archetypes, Fuqua elevates the film from political fantasy to timeless allegory. It's not America under siege. It's Olympus itself, civilization tested by its own pride. Another recurrent motif is sacrifice. The narrative constantly equates salvation with loss. The Secret Service agents who died defending the president, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and Banning's own moral injuries all remind us that security is never free. Even at the film's triumphant ending, the cost lingers. The flag rises again, but the camera lingers on smoke and ruin. Fuqua resists clean catharsis. He wants the audience to feel the price of stability. The symbolism is unmistakable. Every resurrection requires death, and every system rebuilt carries ghosts in its foundations. One of the quieter yet most resonant themes is masculinity under strain. The film belongs to a lineage of stories, from High Noon to Die Hard, where a lone man carries the moral weight of civilization on his shoulders. But unlike the swaggering heroes of older action films, Banning's masculinity feels wounded, introspective. His stoicism hides guilt. His strength comes from grief. In a sense, Fuqua reclaims the idea of male heroism from bravado and redefines it as endurance, the ability to continue despite shame. It's a vision of masculinity that bleeds, limps, and prays, a deeply human kind of strength. Olympus Has Fallen also grapples with patriotism and its paradoxes. The film loves America enough to question it. Fuqua films the flag not as a triumphant emblem, but as a recurring wound, tattered, burning, falling, and finally raised again. That cyclical imagery speaks to a deeper point. Nations, like people, must fall to remember humility. When the flag is raised at the end, it's not a victory shot. It's an act of mourning. The gesture feels less like celebration and more like recommitment. A fragile faith restored after devastation. Patriotism here isn't blind pride. It's endurance through disillusionment. The film's political subtext, often overlooked, also deals with the anxiety of global power shift. The antagonists, though fictionalized, represent forces from outside the Western order striking at its symbolic heart. It's a cinematic reflection of the early 2010s, a period when America's invulnerability was no longer guaranteed, and foreign policy confidence had eroded. By staging the fall of the White House, Fuqua externalized a collective unease. What happens when empire meets entropy? That theme extends beyond the United States. It's a universal fear of civilizations realizing they're not immortal. Fuqua's religious sensibility, subtle but unmistakable, gives the story a moral spine. Throughout his career, he's been drawn to redemption narratives that echo biblical structure: fall, confession, atonement, rebirth. Olympus Has Fallen follows that rhythm perfectly. The president's capture evokes crucifixion. Banning's journey through darkness mirrors descent into hell. The restoration of order resembles resurrection. Even the use of light in the final scenes feels ecclesiastical, sunlight spilling over wreckage like grace. It's no coincidence that the final note of the score resembles a hymn. There's also an undercurrent of faith in human resilience. Despite the film's violence and cynicism, its moral center insists that courage, even in miniature, can restore meaning. That's why Banning isn't superhuman. He bleeds, stumbles, fears, yet continues. In that persistence lies the film's ultimate statement, that heroism isn't perfection, but refusal to surrender. Olympus may fall again and again, but as long as one person stands in ashes, there's hope for renewal. In the end, all these symbols, Olympus, Cerberus, the flag, the snow, converge into a single truth: the fall is necessary. The film's title sounds catastrophic, but within it lies rebirth. The fall of Olympus isn't apocalypse. It's reckoning. It's the destruction that precedes clarity, the collapse that clears room for conscience. That's why Olympus Has Fallen feels strangely cathartic even amid rubble. It tells us that ruin, when faced with honesty, can cleanse, and that, beneath the surface of bullets and smoke, is what the film has always been about: the fall we fear, and the grace that sometimes follows it. When people talk about Olympus Has Fallen, they often mention its intensity before its craft, the way it hits you rather than how it's built. Yet its power doesn't come from noise alone. It comes from precision. Antoine Fuqua, who has always filmed violence like Confession, built the movie's impact on deliberate technical choices: lens, light, sound, rhythm, and structure working in ruthless unison. You feel it in your pulse before you even notice its design. It's that invisible discipline, the architecture beneath the chaos, that makes the film so relentlessly gripping. Fuqua's directing philosophy was rooted in realism. He despised glossy action for its detachment and insisted that Olympus Has Fallen look like a documentary that stumbled into apocalypse. The decision to shoot primarily with handheld cameras, using ARRI Alexa digital rigs stripped of stabilizers, gave the movie its signature jitter. Not the artificial shake of post-production, but the tremor of adrenaline. During the siege, the camera becomes another survivor, ducking, weaving, gasping for breath. The operators were instructed to move as if under fire themselves, creating an intimacy between chaos and audience that few action films achieve. Lighting was just as strategic. Cinematographer Conrad W. Hall avoided clean illumination, choosing instead to light through obstruction, lamps behind smoke, flashlights cutting across debris, muzzle flashes doubling as exposure sources. This technique, called motivated lighting, makes the film feel natural yet haunted. You never see light that doesn't belong to the world of the scene. It's an aesthetic decision with philosophical weight. Truth emerging through destruction, clarity only after chaos. Even the dim color grading, blue-gray midtones fading into ochre warmth at the end, traces Banning's moral journey from despair to fragile redemption. The editing, handled by Conrad Butler, who also worked on Titanic and Terminator 2, embodies surgical control. Every frame obeys rhythm rather than spectacle. Fuqua and Buff divided the action into breaths, bursts of frantic energy followed by half-second pauses of quiet. It's this alternation that keeps tension sustainable. If the pace never slowed, the audience would detach. If it lingered too long, the momentum would die. Buff's editing walks that razor line, letting us exhale just enough before plunging us back into fire. In one of his interviews, he said, "We cut to heartbeats, not to beats." You can feel that in sequences like Banning's corridor fights, edited like Panic, felt like Pulse. The sound design, often unnoticed yet essential, turns architecture into instrument. Every hallway echoes differently. Every bullet has personality. The sound team layer recordings from real gun ranges with synthesized low-end frequencies to mimic the way bass reverberates through plaster. During explosions, they mix faint human screams underneath the roar. Not loud enough to distract, but enough to haunt. It's a sensory ghost that lingers even after silence returns. Trevor Morris's score avoids dominance. Instead, it breathes between sounds, emphasizing emotion only when stillness would feel unbearable. The music doesn't tell us what to feel. It acknowledges what we already do. Fuqua's framing choices also deserve credit for the film's psychological texture. He favors medium close-ups rather than sweeping hero shots. By keeping the camera tight on Butler's face, he transforms a typical action lead into a study of fatigue. The audience isn't gazing at a savior from afar. It's trapped with him. When Banning pauses, sweating, gun trembling, the proximity forces empathy. This technique, borrowed from war photography, makes heroism look exhausting instead of glamorous. It's not the mythic hero of 300. It's a soldier on the edge of collapse. Even the choreography of violence followed character logic. Fuqua demanded that every hit tell story. Banning's early fights are brutal but uncertain, fueled by desperation. As he regains confidence, his movements tighten. Fewer wasted blows, cleaner kills. The action becomes language, violence as recovery of self. The final fight with Kong reflects that arc. Less about dominance, more about moral inevitability. Fuqua reportedly told both actors, "You're not fighting each other. You're fighting what you believe in." That line shaped the choreography into something closer to ritual than spectacle. Special effects blended physical craft with digital restraint. Instead of endless green screens, the production relied on practical detonations enhanced with compositing. Miniatures, pyrotechnics, and digital smoke combined seamlessly because Fuqua limited CGI to what couldn't be achieved in camera. "If it doesn't light the actor's face, it's not real enough," he told his effects team. That insistence gave Olympus Has Fallen a visceral credibility, missing from most of its contemporaries. It's why, even a decade later, the destruction still feels tactile. You can sense gravity, dust, friction. Fuqua's direction also extended performance rhythm. He used long takes during dialogue, cutting only when emotion shifted naturally. This creates unbroken psychological tension between characters, particularly in the bunker scenes. When Kong speaks to the president, the camera barely moves. The lack of cutting becomes confrontation itself, forcing the audience to share the claustrophobia of power trapped by violence. The editing slows time not through slow motion but through stillness, a discipline many modern directors avoid. Thematically, the filmmaking techniques reinforce the narrative's core idea: control amidst collapse. Everything, lighting, sound, pacing, embodies the tension between order and chaos. The camera trembles but never loses focus. The sound erupts but never overwhelms dialogue. The edits accelerate but never dissolve coherence. It's cinematic equilibrium, fragility choreographed into structure. That harmony between content and form gives a film its subconscious resonance. The story is about a system surviving assault. The filmmaking itself behaves like that system, battered but intact. When Olympus Has Fallen premiered in March 2013, its technical accomplishments surprised critics as much as its box office resilience. With a $70 million budget, it grossed around $170 million worldwide. Impressive for an R-rated action film competing against younger, glossier rivals. Its domestic haul alone, roughly $98 million, outperformed projections by nearly 40%. What made that success remarkable was timing. It opened just 3 months before White House Down, which had nearly double budget, but fell short at the box office. Audiences seemed to prefer grit over gloss, blood over banner, sincerity over sarcasm. The film's financial victory proved that the mid-budget action drama still had a pulse, that audiences could still rally behind realism and emotion rather than spectacle. Its success spawned 2 sequels, London Has Fallen 2016 and Angel Has Fallen 2019, turning a standalone thriller into a franchise. Yet ironically, none of its successors captured the raw immediacy of the original. Bigger budgets brought more explosions, but less tension. Fuqua didn't return for those sequels, and his absence shows. The later films echo Olympus's structure, but not its soul. Beyond box office, Olympus Has Fallen also rejuvenated careers. For Fuqua, it re-established him as a bankable director of serious action, paving the way for The Equalizer and its franchise. For Butler, it solidified a new identity, not the mythic warrior of 300, but the weary, grounded protector. The movie also reminded studios that sincerity, when executed with conviction, still sells. In an age of irony and CGI overkill, that was almost revolutionary. Looking back now, it's striking how timeless its technical aesthetic feels. The lack of overpolished effects and restrained camera movement make it age like a late 90s thriller, tactile, intimate, credible. Fuqua's choice to keep violence ugly, pacing disciplined, and lighting dirty preserved the film's believability long after its contemporaries faded into digital noise. Every scrape, every thud, every dimly lit hallway still feels real because it was built, lit, and shot by human hands under real strain. Ultimately, the filmmaking of Olympus Has Fallen mirrors its theme: survival through control. It's the art of balance, of a director who found beauty in discipline, tension in quiet, and grandeur in imperfection. And when the final frame fades and a flag rises over to rebuild Olympus, what lingers isn't patriotism or spectacle but admiration. Not for the story alone, but for the craftsmanship that dared to make destruction feel human. Whenever I revisit Olympus Has Fallen, I'm struck not only by the film's intensity, but by the people who carried that weight, the faces, voices, and temperaments behind its storm. It's a film built around conviction, and the cast approached it not as escapism, but as embodiment. In their interviews, they spoke less about entertainment and more about exhaustion, pride, and responsibility, words that rarely appear in press junkets for action thrillers. But that's because Olympus Has Fallen isn't just about spectacle. It's about endurance, both on screen and off. Gerard Butler, at the center of it all, plays Mike Banning with a kind of weary devotion that feels carved from his own experience. In interviews, he often described the film as personal, saying he connected deeply with Banning's guilt and longing for redemption. After 300 had made him a global symbol of bravado, Butler wanted to show fragility behind strength. "This is not a superhero," he said in one conversation. "This is a man who hurts, who fails, who still gets up." He talked about training with real Secret Service operatives, learning tactical movements, and understanding the discipline behind silence. When asked about his most memorable moment, he didn't mention the explosions or fights, but the scene with the president's son. "That's the one that made me breathe differently," he said, "because that's what saving really means. Not power, but care." Aaron Eckhart, who plays President Asher, brought elegance and humanity to what could have been a symbolic role. He approached the character as a man stripped of office, not protected by it. "A president is only impressive when the room is full," he said in an interview. "When the walls fall, he's just another man trying not to break." He studied old footage of Kennedy and Reagan during crises, noting how they concealed fear with posture. On set, he refused to sit between takes, not out of ego, but to maintain tension. Butler once said Eckhart's discipline made everyone else stand straighter. Together, their chemistry grounded the film's emotional axis. Two men bound by guilt and trust, finding redemption in each other's endurance. Morgan Freeman, who steps in as acting President Trumbull, gave the film its spiritual gravity. In press appearances, he spoke of his character not as a leader, but as a voice of calm when faith is shaking. He's one of those actors who never seems to perform. He simply exists, and the world rearranges around him. His calm tone, the measured cadence of his speech, lends a chaos dignity. In one behind-the-scenes clip, Freeman reads a technical line about nuclear codes and somehow turns it into something biblical. That's his magic, making bureaucracy sound like scripture. Angela Bassett, as Lynn Jacobs, radiates authority without needing to prove it. Her presence is both maternal and militant. In interviews, she described her role as the moral conscience of the system, the one who sees the toll behind protocol. She trained in firearms handling and tactical movement, but admitted that her real preparation was emotional. The hardest part wasn't pretending to shoot, she said. It was pretending not to feel. Bassett's grounded energy gives a film its empathy. She becomes a quiet witness to sacrifice, the personification of what leadership costs in silence. Rick Yune's portrayal of Kong remains one of the film's most haunting elements. His villain isn't a caricature. He's composed, elegant, and utterly certain. Yune approached him as a philosopher-soldier rather than a terrorist. He believes in his cause, he said, and belief is more dangerous than bullets. He drew inspiration from samurai ethics, combining courtesy with ruthlessness. What's chilling is that Kong never loses his calm, even in defeat, a reflection, Yune explained, of the serenity that comes when you stop fearing death. His performance gives the film a strangely meditative quality. You fear him not for his violence, but for his clarity. Even the supporting cast, Dylan McDermott as a traitorous Secret Service agent Forbes, Radha Mitchell as Banning's wife Leah, and Melissa Leo as the Secretary of Defense, contribute to the film's psychological density. McDermott's turn as a man who betrays his oath adds texture to the narrative's moral landscape. He plays Forbes not as a monster, but as a man who gave up hope, and that's what makes him dangerous. Leo, meanwhile, brings fire to what could have been a victim's role. Her defiance under torture, her scream of "go to hell," became one of the movie's most quoted moments. She later said she didn't plan it. It just came out because I believed her fear. Critics initially gave mixed reactions, but audiences responded with fervor. CinemaScore surveys gave it a rare grade for an R-rated action film. Viewers describe it as raw, emotional, old school, and real. The fan base that grew around the movie was unusual. Not just young action fans, but veterans, firefighters, and first responders. On online forums, soldiers praised his portrayal of courage without invincibility. One retired Marine wrote, "That's the closest I've seen Hollywood come to what resolve looks like." Another audience member described it simply, "You believe him. You believe Butler's pain." Interviews with Antoine Fuqua after release reveal how much he valued that connection. "I didn't want applause," he said. "I wanted respect." He spoke about how audiences in small American towns would come up to him after screenings and say, "Thank you," not for the patriotism, but for showing that courage still exists in flawed men. He found that humbling. "Cinema is church for people who can't find language for faith," he said. "Sometimes a sermon comes with bullets." Interestingly, even international audiences, despite the film's heavy American iconography, found resonance in its emotional universality. In interviews in Europe and Asia, Butler often said fans related not to politics, but to the archetype of protector. "It's about standing when everything falls," he explained. Every culture understands that. The film's success overseas surprised analysts. Nearly half its global gross came from outside the U.S., proving that sincerity translates better than slogans. By the time the sequels arrived, the original had already become something of a cult touchstone. Viewers who dismissed it on release later returned, finding it a kind of nostalgic purity, a reminder when action films still felt personal. Even critics softened. Retrospective reviews from outlets like Screen Rant and Collider now praise its practical filmmaking and emotional honesty, calling it a relic of sincerity in a cynical era. Butler, looking back years later, said, "We made that one with our hearts. Maybe that's why it hit harder than it should have." What I love most about hearing these reflections is how they reveal the soul behind the spectacle. The cast didn't treat Olympus Has Fallen as a paycheck project. They treated it like endurance art, an exercise in conviction. Every interview feels less like promotion and more like testimony. And maybe that's why audiences still remember it. Beneath the explosions and slogans was a film made by people who believed in what it meant to stand guard, not over a nation, but over the fragile dignity of human courage. When the smoke clears and the last gunshot fades, what remains of Olympus Has Fallen isn't the spectacle. It's the silence after the storm. That quiet, heavy stillness when the flag rises again and everyone exhales as if remembering how to breathe. Watching it today, more than a decade later, I don't see a political fantasy or a power drama. I see a confession. A film that looks directly into the modern world's unease, the exhaustion beneath strength, the guilt beneath patriotism, the tenderness beneath steel. It's a movie about a nation trying to remember what courage feels like when all its myths have cracked. There's a peculiar honesty to the way Antoine Fuqua frames resilience. He doesn't glorify violence or dress heroism in perfection. He shows men and women who are scared, bruised, uncertain, but who move anyway. That's what gives a film its pulse. Beneath every explosion lies a heartbeat. Beneath every line of duty lies fatigue. And that, perhaps, is what makes it timeless. We live in an age addicted to certainty, to invincible superheroes and unbreakable systems. But Olympus Has Fallen reminds us that the most powerful form of strength is endurance. To fall and stand again, to protect something fragile not because it's flawless, but because it's ours. That's the film's quiet philosophy. I often think of Mike Banning not as an action hero, but as an allegory for conscience, a man who fails in the light and redeems himself in the dark. His story isn't about winning. It's about being willing. The way Butler plays him, without glamour, without self-pity, makes him almost symbolic of anyone who's ever carried the weight of one irreversible mistake. His heroism feels private, inward, spiritual. He's not saving the world for applause. He's saving it because he can't not try. And maybe that's the kind of courage we need more of, the kind that doesn't announce itself. That just keeps showing up. The movie's power, to me, lies in its duality, both mythic and human, both grand and intimate. The fall of Olympus sounds like something from Scripture, yet Fuqua grounded in sweat, rubble, and blood. He bridges epic myth with tactile realism, showing that the sacred and the brutal often coexist. It's that fusion that makes the film resonate beyond its genre. The White House here isn't just a building. It's an idea, a vessel for human ambition and human failure. Its fall isn't merely catastrophe. It's revelation. In the destruction of Olympus, we see the truth about all fortresses. They endure not because they're indestructible, but because someone keeps rebuilding them. And then there's the tone, the way the film mourns even as it fights. Trevor Morris's score doesn't celebrate victory. It grieves it. The final moments, bathed in sunlight, don't feel like triumph but reconciliation. We sense that the cost of order has been counted, and that peace, like the flag that flutters back to life, is fragile. I love that Fuqua doesn't chase euphoria. He lets us sit in quiet awe instead, because real victory, the film seems to say, is never loud. It's a sigh of relief whispered in the ruins. Looking back now, the film feels prophetic, not politically, but emotionally. It captured a mood that would only deepen in the years that followed. The anxiety of nations and individuals unsure of what still holds. Watching it today, in a world still obsessed with collapse and resilience, Olympus Has Fallen feels oddly comforting. It reminds us that even when symbols crumble, people don't always do. That sometimes all it takes to hold the line is one person refusing to surrender, not because he's unbreakable, but because he believes that something, somewhere, is still worth saving. Fuqua's craft, Butler's exhaustion, Freeman's calm, Bassett's quiet dignity. They all come together like parts in elegy. There's not a false note among them, because every performance seems to understand what the film itself is confessing, That courage without humility is empty, and power without empathy is brittle. The movie isn't asking us to worship the flag. It's asking us to respect the people who keep holding it up even when it's torn. What lingers most for me, though, is the humanity threaded through its violence. The small moments, Banning whispering reassurance to the president's son, the way his voice breaks when he reestablishes contact, the president's trembling defiance in the bunker. These fragments humanize the myth. They remind us that even in stories of grandeur and chaos, it's always the quiet gestures that matter most. A hand on a shoulder, a breath caught between fear and resolve, a look that says, "I'm still here." By the time the credits roll, we're left with something unexpected, a sense of solemn gratitude, not for victory, but for survival. The rebuilding of Olympus becomes a metaphor for how we all endure the collapses in our own lives. We fall, we fail, we lose our bearings, and yet somehow we keep rebuilding our small temples of meaning. Maybe that's why the film's closing image still feels moving, because it mirrors us. A scarred structure standing tall again, imperfect but upright, shining under the same sun that watched it burn. And perhaps that's the final gift of Olympus Has Fallen. It redefines what it means to rise. It tells us that strength isn't the absence of fear or the guarantee of success. It's persistence through failure. It's loyalty that survives disillusionment. It's faith reborn not in perfection, but in resilience. The gods of Olympus may have fallen, but humanity, tired, bruised, imperfect humanity, keeps climbing back up, and in that climb lies something more enduring than invincibility: grace. So, literature-loving friends, if this reflection resonated with you, stay a little while longer in our corner of cinema and meaning. Like this video if it made you feel something. Subscribe if you love films that hide philosophy beneath fire and faith beneath rubble. And as always, thank you for watching, thank you for feeling, and thank you for keeping the flame of thoughtful cinema alive. Until next time, may your Olympus, whatever it is, always rise again.